One of the most profound ideas that I've encountered recently came from a book I was reading by Douglas Wilson, where he said, "We must have a doctrine of history. Of course, the kingdom of God is not to be identified with Western culture, but the stories of each are so intertwined that we cannot hope to understand the course of one without knowing the history of the other. As Christian educators, this means that Constantine and Charlemagne will always be more significant to us than the Ming dynasty." And this idea of developing a doctrine of history, or another way of framing it would be letting your Christian worldview inform how you engage with history, has just been something I've been wrestling with for months on end now. And one thing that brought it up again was I was watching this video by Ryan Holiday, who is an author who I very much respect, and he's one of my favorites. Like, I love his books. His books are on the bookshelf right beside my bed, right? This is a guy that I very much love and think is very wise. But I was watching a video by him, and he was talking about the importance of reading history. And one of the things that I realized was like, oh my gosh, Ryan is saying something that I agree with the words that he's saying, but we mean different things by those words. And we have different reasons for why we would say those words. So what Ryan is saying is that it's important to study history. We have to study history. And I'm like, yes, 100%. I totally agree with that, right? But then as we're digging more into this and I'm thinking about it, what is informing Ryan's view of why we need to study history is fundamentally a secular worldview. Ryan is not a believer, right? And so his view of why we need to study history comes from a secular answer to the three worldview questions, right? Which is creation, the fall, redemption. Where do we come from? What went wrong? What do we do to fix it, right? So he has secular answers to these questions, which inform the doctrine of history that he has, which would mean that his answer to why should we study history and what history should we study is something akin to, we need to study all of the bad things that happened in history so that we figure out what caused those bad things, what systems caused those bad things, so that we can not repeat them in the future, right? And it's based on a fundamental secular idea that humans are by default good, and so by default we would do the right things if we just didn't have these systems that were screwing us up and causing us to do the wrong thing. So we're going to study history looking for the external factors that are what caused us to not do the good thing that we would have inherently done, right? And so that informs the kinds of books that he believes are the history books that we need to engage with and that we need to study, right? This is very different from the answers to what history books should we study and how that emerges from a Christian worldview, right? So the Christian worldview that answers to creation, the fall, and redemption, right? All of these are what are in the Bible. And what the Christian worldview would say is that the fundamental problem is not that there are external forces that are keeping us from doing the good that we would naturally do, right? The problem is that naturally we want to do the bad things because naturally we have a sin nature, right? So it's the polar opposite foundational view of why should we study history, because the foundational view of what is going to happen moving forward in the secular answer is, well, unless something gets in the way, we're going to do the good things, right? Versus a Christian worldview would say, unless something gets in the way, we're going to do the bad things, right? So the Christian view of history, looking at it, would be that we're not so much concerned with studying all of the bad things that happened or all of the bad things that we've done or all of the external systems and whatever that seemingly are what caused us to do the bad things, because we already know why we did the bad things. We did the bad things because we have a sin nature, right? So my focus in looking at history and the kinds of books that I want to read and the kinds of things that I think are important to study are not the same kind of books that he would come to from the conclusion from the secular worldview. So books that are all about, the caste system or all about the whatever, the capitalist system and how that made everybody bad and whatever. Books that are focused on a external force and saying that external force is what caused these individual people to do bad things are not things that actually align with the worldview that I have, right? So the history books that I'm looking for are less books about the external force and how that made me do bad things, right? And more books about how did someone overcome the inherent internal force that would have caused them to do bad things, right? So I'm looking for books that instead of showing an example of what not to do, right? Because if we just know what not to do, then we won't do it, right? I'm looking for books that show what to do, because if we don't know what to do, then by default, we will do what we shouldn't do, right? Because we have a sin nature. So this idea that we can say the same thing, but mean totally different things by it is super, super fascinating to me. And it's this all culminated in this idea that, again, that Doug Wilson quote brought up, is that we have to have a doctrine of history, and we have to let the answers that the Christian worldview gives to the worldview questions, right? Those answers should inform how we do everything else, including how we study history. And one of the problems with this is it makes it seem to an outside perspective, or what a lot of the secularist arguments would be against this, is that, oh, you only want to look at the positive sides of history, right? And Ryan even said this in his video. He's like, if the history you're reading makes you feel good, it's probably not real history, right? Which on the one hand is kind of like, yes, that's true. There's always some element to a historical story that, even if you think, it's, everything was all wonderful and roses and whatever there, it really wasn't. There was something bad somewhere, right? But in a certain sense, if you step back from it and you imagine history as just the story of your life, right? And you look at the epochs of history as just each individual days in your life, right? One of the ways that we can kind of test which is the better way of going back and looking at this is, it's like, if you go back and look at your day, or any particular day, from the last year, and you pull it out, the secular argument is that the most useful way to examine that particular day of your life was to rehash and just dig into and tear apart all of the worst things that you did that day, right? And the idea is because tomorrow, by default, you will just do all good and great things, as long as you figure out what caused you to do the bad things in the first place, right? So you're going to look at that and you're going to focus on all of the bad things and whatever. And as long as you know all of the bad things that caused you to do the bad things, then tomorrow you'll be able to live and do all the good things that you want to do, right? That's one way of viewing it. Or you can go back and look at it and you can say, what was the best part of my day? How did I handle myself in the best way, with the most love, with the most grace, with the most joy and peace and patience and all this? How did I perform best in this particular day of my history? And then how can I replicate that tomorrow, right? Focusing just on how did I perform best is not necessarily whitewashing the fact that you did bad things, right? It's not necessarily whitewashing that you weren't at your best all day long, right? But it is something where it is choosing to focus on the thing that will help you make the best decisions in the day moving forward tomorrow. So the argument that just because you're focusing on the best things of that day by default means that you're just completely ignoring all the worst things is not actually true. It might be true, but it's not just true by default. Just because I choose to focus on the good things that I did that day doesn't mean that I'm denying all the bad things. It is, though, a thing where the question that we need to ask is, how useful is it to focus on those bad things as opposed to focusing on the good thing? And again, this is where we go back to this worldview thing. It would seem very useful to focus on the bad things if the reality is that tomorrow I will do good things by default unless the external things that cause me to do something bad are still in place, right? If that actually is the case, then it would be very useful to study all the bad stuff of history. If, though, you believe that that is not the case, if you believe that you did bad things because you have a sin nature, right, then trying to find the external forces of what caused you to do the bad things in the first place is not actually a useful thing at all, right? You're going to do the bad things like inherently. Just if you do nothing, you will do the bad things because you have a sin nature, right? I think what I'm trying to get at with this is that if you are a Christian and you're trying to study history from a Christian perspective and you're trying to allow your Christian worldview to inform how you do everything, including how you study history, do not get pulled into the idea, and because really all it is a false dilemma of like, well, if you're going to if you're just going to focus on the good, then you're obviously ignoring the bad. And it's like, well, no, I'm not obviously ignoring the bad. I'm just not focusing on it, right? So don't get pulled into this false dilemma of the argument of, if you are just going to focus on the good things of history, and if your history makes you feel good, then it's not real history, right? that is actually a pretty shallow argument. And even in the places where it's not shallow, it still comes back to, okay, yes, no one has a perfectly perfect day and no one has a perfectly terrible day. Every day is made up of some good and some bad, right? So even in the instances where that argument is valid, there is still the question of, but what I choose to focus on is based on what I believe will fix the problem. And if you have a Christian worldview and you believe that what will fix the problem is not fixing the external structures, but fixing yourself, then you don't need to feel bad and you don't need to be coerced into studying history with a focus on the good things of history, right? Instead of the bad things, right? So, yeah, hopefully that makes sense. This is kind of rambly, but hopefully that makes sense. It's really something that's been on my heart a lot. I've been thinking about it a lot. And yeah, if this is something that you struggled with, let me know, because there's a very strong push in that direction. It's probably kind of best codified in this idea of like, if the history you're reading makes you feel good, it's probably not real history. And I'm like, no, it's totally real history. It's like, it actually happened. You actually had a good day yesterday, and it's like, just because it rained yesterday at one point doesn't mean that the sun didn't also come up yesterday morning. Like, it was sunny in the morning and then it rained in the afternoon. Well, you're just focusing on the bright sunny stuff. And you're like, yes, but that doesn't mean that I'm sitting here being like, and the bad things never happened, right? So don't fall for this false dilemma of just because you're focusing on the good automatically means you're denying the bad. Now, if you are denying the bad, you probably shouldn't do that, right? There is bad things that have happened, right? And you need to be at least minimally aware of those things. But the core reason for solely focusing on the bad things is because you think that we would do good things by default. And if you just figure out what caused the external forces that caused the bad thing, then everything would be perfect, right? So the only reason why your focus of history is solely on the bad is because your worldview says that redemption comes through us, right? Which is the exact opposite of what an actual Christian worldview says. So if you hold the Christian worldview and you're finding yourself reading and focusing on history books that other people don't agree with, and they think you're just all Mr. Sunshine and whatever, and you don't want to focus on the real stuff, make sure you're telling the truth. Make sure you're not just like trying to hide from the bad things, but also realize that just not focusing on the bad thing is not the same thing as denying the bad thing, right? And only focusing on the good thing, or primarily focusing on the good thing, is not the same thing as just denying that the bad thing ever happened, right? So, false dilemma, don't fall for it. That's all I got. See you in the next one.